I bet most of you didn't know that at the end of the War of 1812, the fighting with Great Britain may have been over, but the fighting overseas was not. There was one more action to complete in 1815. The United States Navy, although we lost a lot of merchant ships and we took out a lot of English merchant ships as well, one of the things that actually prevented England from continuing the war was that it was expensive, and why the hell would you bother to continue the war when they defeated Napoleon? But the American Navy was, for the most part, intact. All 10 ships that we had, and we had some ship-to-ship victories against the English, which was demoralizing for the English, and it gave at least the United States public something to cheer about in the most awful year of the war, probably 1812, and allowed Madison to hold on and win re-election. The Barbary states in North Africa had taken advantage of the U.S. And our lack of ability to retaliate, and had continued to capture American merchant ships and imprison their crew. When the war was over, this became a situation absolutely intolerable. Now with it's often called this the Second Barbary War. And sometimes we say that James Madison is the only president to have declared war twice. I can't find any evidence, and we should have the evidence, it's Congress, that he actually asked Congress for a declaration of war. He asked them for basically what presidents often do, the permission to use the United States Armed Services to go into battle, and not so much a formal declaration of war. He sent them this time against the North African country of Algiers in March of 1815. So the war had ended December 1814, and now we have this military action. The Dey of Algiers, that's the leader, D-E-Y, the Dey of Algiers, had sided with Great Britain. And Great Britain at that point didn't have a lot of ships in the Mediterranean, either did the United States. But with peace, there are more U.S. exports entering the area. And that's why we feel the need, or Madison and his cabinet feels the need, to send the Navy. The end of the British blockade came about with the war ending, and so why not? It made a lot of sense. Madison asks Congress for war. He doesn't get it. He instead gets an authorization to send the troops into the area. A good Jeffersonian. A short-term military action is swift, less expensive than continuing the alternatives of paying the bribes. It's a mistake to call these groups of nations pirates, but we always do. The North African Barbary pirates. Piracy indicates or connotates illegal activity. These governments did that. I mean, they allowed the captains of their ships to carry out this action against other foreign countries. It's a hostile government engaging in an act of warfare. So piracy isn't really the name we should give it. Smaller nations, as we know, like the United States, had trouble coming up with a tribute or paying the ransom once those sailors, not only their cargoes and their ships could be captured, but they were taken prisoner as well. Two veterans of the Tripoli campaign, which was led by Thomas Jefferson in the previous administration, led the Navy. Stephen Decatur captured a significant Algerian corsair, and two naval squadrons totaling 17 ships. I mean, wow. I mean, we organized a pretty impressive flotilla there, basically sending the whole Navy. I mean, there's no reason to keep them in American home waters when there's no threat from Great Britain or France. So 17 ships sail into the Mediterranean, the largest fleet up to that point we had ever mobilized for one particular military action. After losing several vessels to American forces, the Algerian government capitulates. Again, proof that these aren't pirates. These are people acting on behalf of the Algerian government, and they ask for a treaty. And they sign a treaty with the United States. No more tribute. No more payments, annuity payments from the United States to Algiers. They also released Americans who were held captive in Algerian prisons and paid compensation for their prison time. Wow. So Madison shivered the timbers more of the North African nations, maybe even more successfully than Jefferson. The U.S. demands their own prisoners and detainees of other countries be released. And they did it. It worked. Europe hadn't been able to do it, and the United States did it. John Quincy Adams, the minister to Great Britain, sees this as one of the most splendid events in 1815, and I bet money most people don't know about it. Experts maybe in naval history. Can there be any wonder about American pride in the months after New Orleans, Ghent, North Africa? Put it all together. Big picture. This is why the United States begins to redefine itself after 1815. The following year, an Anglo-Dutch force destroys more locations in Algiers and gets another 1,100 prisoners released, following up on the success that the United States had. Why not? They say, we'll do it as well. They vow to no longer does the government of Algiers enslave Christians. Closes decades of problems with the Barbary nations. Not until the late 20th century will the United States make war against a Muslim ruler. 1991, right? To the people of the nation, the United States was more and more considered a force to be reckoned with. 8.5 million people in 1815. It nears the total of Great Britain. Franklin always knew it was going to happen. Didn't happen in his lifetime. But he saw at least the beginnings of the American population explosion. And who makes up the American population is significant. That number, 8.5 million, doubled, more than doubled, what it had been over the last 25 years. In 1790, we're talking about 4 million people, now 8.5, a full generation later. In 1815, the United States is comprised of 18 states, 13 original colonies, with Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and Louisiana added, and their names are there on the notes. There are also 5 territories in existence: Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, and Mississippi, which had been formed around the time of the War of 1812. The old 18th century colonial model is being slowly replaced by an enterprising, self-confident people after the war. The Second War of American Independence. That's what people called it. We today think, the War of 1812, I think it happened around 1812. But I know, and I've made it clear to you, we should remember more about it and the reasons why it is significant. It is also a young population. Anyone 40 or younger was born in an America not the subject of George III. Anyone 40 or younger had not been born a British citizen. How much? Okay, you're thinking that's great, but how much of the percentage is that? 85% of the United States in 1815 had not been born English subjects. The generation of the founding is passing right before everyone's eyes. And a new youthful energy is part of the United States. 2 lessons could be learned from the war and from the last battle, the battle that actually took place after the war ended. Number 1, militia did not fight against the British well. The professionalization of the American Army, which at first started to be established with, ironically, Thomas Jefferson and the creation of West Point. Once you got rid of the past their shelf life generals associated with the American Revolution and brought in new, younger individuals wearing the gray coats and blue coats of the United States Army, the cadets from West Point, Winfield Scott, who is going to be a leader in the new, streamlined and small American Army. The other lesson, well, several lessons. Technology. Technology won the battle. Cannon, forged in armories, paid for by the government, had tipped the balance, and basically made the Battle of New Orleans a bloodbath. 2,000 British casualties, what, 20 American? The British were gunned down before they even got within musket range. You fire the cannon solid shot, and then when they get closer, you load cannons basically with giant, like shotgun shells.
Grape shot.
Grape shot, exactly, Gregory, exactly. And they would be larger than a musket ball, and they would just do an incredible amount of damage. Imagine 20 or 30 of those in a canister, as they also call grape shot, canister, at point blank range. It just would take out multiple individuals, obviously. The other lesson, again, the technology aspect. We also, have this mythology of the Kentucky and Tennessee volunteers and their long rifles, and no, not really. It was the cannon and the technological advancement. It's not the first war that the United States will lean on technology to give us an edge. The other lesson is communication was slow. The speed at which news moved was something of an embarrassment. The war started after the British changed their minds about seizing American ships. We just couldn't get the news. I mean, if that was the case, begs the question, right? Then why don't you just end the war and say, oops? But apparently we went off the cliff too far at that point. The last battle also had happened 2 weeks after the treaty and illustrated one of the new challenges after the War of 1812. In other words, navies and industrial production that made cannon had saved the nation and not necessarily the militia. So that old reliance on the volunteer citizen soldier that the mythology of the Revolution said won independence from Great Britain. The generals knew better. That wasn't the case. Nevertheless, we walked away from the war saying that Madison had upheld Republican values. We didn't go heavily into debt. We didn't assert powers of the government, which, yes, he may have taken during the war, but gave back. No clamping down on civil liberties. I mean, he was frustrated, as was Jefferson, at the fact that the embargo didn't work and counties and states were flaunting the laws. But we held on and fought Great Britain to a draw again. So we have something of what I like to call a wake-up call. Maybe there is a need for a wake-up call in the United States to address the speed of communication, maybe a new role of government, maybe the fact that we should, if we are ending the mindset of being a colonial nation under Great Britain, because most of our population was born after 1776, then we should act like one. I think the war produced some call for change. It would be controversial. Not everyone would agree with it. It would cause a division in the political parties, even after we see the birth of one-party government for at least a short time in the United States. By 1815, changes everywhere, especially in the North. There's a new thinking about making money. That generation, born after independence from Great Britain, was stopped this practice of wringing their hands about acquiring money and the character of American culture. There's more awareness of the importance of domestic manufacturing, and that is a cause of the embargo. The embargo really brought that idea. Domestic manufacturing and internal trade would be the key to the wealth of the United States. Jefferson always lamented the fact that people who were engaged in trade didn't seem to do it, but really it kept the economy strong in his presidency. With the embargo and the so-called non-intercourse agreements of the beginnings of Madison's administration, we get far fewer manufacturing items from England. That means rising prices for American products. The number of patents in the United States explode in the decade after the embargo. And we begin to invest in home markets. I call it that light bulb moment when everyone's like, wait a minute, if we can't buy it from Europe, Can we make it here? Ding, cue the light bulb. And it happens. It happens. It becomes a reality. Give you a couple of examples. In 1808, there are 15 cotton mills in the United States. Okay, not so impressive. By the end of 1809, 87 more are added. That gives us over 100. Small factories begin to spring up in the nation. Let me show you a couple slides I might have of this. Probably familiar with the story of the Lowell mills that are being born, especially in New England. That's one of them, Samuel Slater's mill, where you have the swift running river, as you can see there in the corner of this slide. It's a, not what we are accustomed to thinking with a factory, but, it looks like a 4-story building built in the colonial style. The pastoral England scenery there, people are looking at it, I guess, in the foreground there, marveling at what they see with this this new place where people go and work is designated here, out of their home, and where there is small domestic manufacturing for trade and bartering, and here's a dedicated place, a building, by which people will spend hours by daylight. Sorry?
It may have been made pretty on the outside, but on the inside it was hell.
Look more like that. You can see this, again, probably an idealized version. Doesn't show people kind of stooped over for a long time. No laws on number of hours you can work, how many, the dangerous conditions, and meant to be temporary though.
Child labor.
Yep, child labor. No limits on the hours, no workers' compensation, nothing like that, no safety features built in. But the argument would be this is a way for young ladies to supplement their family income temporarily until they what?
Married.
Got married. Not getting married? Whoa, that was unthinkable. I mean, it's a different time period. Now it's quite a bit different with expectations, obviously, with people getting married later or sometimes not at all. In New England, you hear the expression, quote, "Our people have cotton mill fever. Spinning yarn and making cloth has become our greatest business," unquote. That's when the Slater mills arrived. Francis Cabot Lowell went to England and he just stared at the production in England, because when you left, you were literally patted down to make sure you didn't have schematics of the plans of the English mills in their infancy of the Industrial Revolution. He had it all up here. They couldn't, defrag his brain, because that's where he had it, wrote it all down and said, this is how we create this in the United States.
But they didn't think about that beforehand.
Probably did, but they thought, who could have literally memorized with a photographic memory? I mean, and they probably also would have thought this is going to get out at some point eventually. But do we in England have enough of a head start where, the former colonies, the United States, could even rival us? Well, we don't necessarily have to have the same industrial production, but we're going to find, for the English point of view, we have something they want. Cotton, obviously, that's going to go over there. Yeah, and feed not only the New England mills, but those in England as well. Okay, back to the notes here real quick. Oh, there we go, I think. Hello. There we go. So the workforce is changing dramatically. That's the takeaway, and the fact that people are working out of their home. By 1820, a quarter of the labor force in New England and the mid-Atlantic states work in small factories. 25% of the workforce. Been unthinkable a generation before. Even those who do not produce for export market get involved. They trade with their neighbors. By 1815, the United States is rural and agricultural, but we're becoming more industrial. Rural and agricultural and more commercial, especially in the North. American desire to trade, says Henry Clay, who had first gotten elected to Congress right before the beginning of the War of 1812, says, "There is a passion as unconquerable as any with which nature has endowed us. You may attempt to regulate, you cannot destroy," unquote. So for all the talk about the export market, the home market is critically important as well. We have an intense involvement in overseas trade, the carrying trade. This is where we measure the economy, exports, imports, and all that. But within the country, doesn't get measured a lot. That's becoming a strong element of the nation as well. And if you have, this is what channels the other question being brought up in 1815 and 1816. We have to have the ability to move our American-made products within the United States. I mean, short of technological changes for ships moving faster and carrying more goods, what about, the land routes, the rivers, lakes, waterways within the United States? Within the country, this heightens the demand for what they would call back then internal improvements. Now, currently, the administration is talking about, our current administration, the idea of an infrastructure bill. And the dollar amount is staggering. To folks back then, it would have been they would have passed out with the total we're talking about. We call it infrastructure, they call it internal improvements. And there's absolutely no question that the national government in Washington, D.C. directs the infrastructure. Now, that's just a blanket statement. Where it goes, how much of it actually is infrastructure, that's a current debate. But the idea back then is, should the federal government take the lead as well, or do you leave it to the states? This is pertinent to today. Because federal infrastructure, some people say, is pretty good. State, not as good. I mean, this idea of a crumbling infrastructure, okay, but let's evaluate that in some more detail. And those are the questions that were being asked 200 years ago in the United States. Roads, canals, ferries, bridges, anything that would increase the speed and lower the costs. That's what folks within the nation are looking for. Internal improvements. That's what they want to make better. Even John Calhoun, another war hawk elected in 1810, new member of Congress, representing South Carolina, believes that federal direction of internal improvements would, quote, bind the republic together, unquote. Why this guy turns 180 degrees? Well, that'll be part of the remainder of this class. Folks begin to realize that the internal trade, like something Lancaster, Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, linking the city to the countryside, is critically important to the nation. If we want to change this post-colonial mindset, we have to actually put changes in place. We're so caught up in the idea that overseas trade is the way to wealth and the only way to measure the American economic wealth. We get lost in the fact that, yes, the balance of foreign trade is important. We want to take in less than we export, but the American backbone of the economy is in the domestic trade. And that all gets back to the President of the United States, outgoing President of the United States, who I think is going to try to use his influence, popular as it is. I mean, even though Dolly Madison literally right before Washington was burned, climbed to the roof of the White House to try to find her husband and, let him know and everyone else that the British had gotten through the defenses and were heading right towards Washington, D.C. Madison, you can't say, was able to get control of his party the same way that his predecessor, Thomas Jefferson, and his mentor did after 1800. But, I think Madison had more challenges than Jefferson. No one in politics feared what he can do. And I don't know why that's a statement that we should say should be attached to leaders of a party. You should be feared, but he's acknowledged to be a very good statesman. But he couldn't get everyone in agreement over what people thought the agenda of the United States should be, our priorities. He's determined to draw lessons from the nation's narrow escape from disaster. That's his agenda, to draw lessons. The idea of America's wake-up call in 1815 and 1816. And it's also a way, as every president wants to do, he has full intentions of retiring after the end of his second term. And this comes down to what every president, especially a two-term president, wants to do, is mark your last month and year in office with legacy projects. You know, working on the environment, dedicating areas to national parks, whatever you think you can get through that is not particularly controversial, isn't going to divide the two parties or even your own party. And I think Madison is going to try to build on some of the good feelings in the country after the Treaty of Ghent. So news of that, early, we're talking January, February 1815. He still has at least almost 2 years in office. So if you can take advantage of the fact that there was this post-war nationalism in the nation, seize it. The whole political idea of never letting a crisis go to waste, we'll never let unity and national pride go to waste as a way to put forth some of your ideas. And to his credit, he has a broad legislative agenda, if he can get the Republicans to go along with it. It's somewhat limited, but he's going to really, I think, come full circle and challenge some of the ideas he had when he was first a congressman, and even before that, when he was at the Constitutional Convention. Americans should have pride, he said, in the defeat of Algiers and the peace with the Indians in the West. That was part of the demands that the British had made. The British abandoned Northwestern Indians. Once the Confederacy ends at the Battle of Thames and Tecumseh is killed, the British essentially, we reconquered the Northwest in 1813. There is a move by the British at the treaty discussions to leave an Indian area for Native Americans. And the United States says, no. And things look really bad. And I mean, this is like Washington burned, Baltimore under attack, the British Navy and Army still moving toward New Orleans. And yet in the midst of all this, I think I outlined this last time, the Americans are just stalwart and stubborn and say, no, I don't think really, I mean, the English are like, we just burned your capital. And we said, no, you still really can't make demands. British are like, these Americans are pretty bold. And so the British walked away from that commitment in their talks. And the American mindset in 1815 is the Indians sided with the British, and they should, be subject to whatever decisions we make. And certainly what went along with that were Jackson's actions to the Creek Indians. I mean, a treaty that was so in favor of the United States that even the administration was like, can we really, I mean, this is almost embarrassingly huge amount of land that Jackson has had the Creeks. I mean, even the Creeks who sided with him had signed over to the nation, and it makes a significant difference. I mean, it really opens up the American Southwest. So what do you do in the aftermath of the war, since you don't need a large political force? You cut the Army. The Navy was kept up for at least temporarily. You keep the coastal defenses of the United States in top working order. Because as much as Jefferson and Madison didn't like the idea that the American government should protect trade and it should be the bulwark of America's economy, it was. So protect the nation from invasion, keep the Navy around, but within the United States, threats? No, not a need for a large standing army. He also suggested, and somewhere Alexander Hamilton was probably rolling over in his grave, Madison suggested the reinstitution of a national bank as a depository for the government's securities and as an institution which could control credit. A major policy change from a man who opposed Hamilton's bank. Members of Congress, members of Madison's party draft the legislation for the chartering of a second Bank of the United States to be put in place in 1815 or 1816. Secondly, you would have, to protect American industry, a tariff. Tax on imports. It would be a revenue measure to protect American infant industries. It would be a patriotic American tariff. We'll get into the nitty-gritty and the details of how it actually operated. It would also help make the nation independent of foreign markets. That, Madison and Jefferson had this notion, was why the nation got involved in this war in the first place. Again, seizing on that American patriotism after the war. The most ambitious part of the plan, quote, was establishing throughout our country the roads and canals which can best be executed under the national authority, unquote. Here is the statement about internal improvements in the United States. Improved transportation. This gets back to two things that we learned from the war. The domestic market could not be neglected. Secondly, it was really hard to move soldiers and communication where we don't have any roads. Into the hinterlands, upstate New York, the Ohio state, the Indiana territory, with paths cut by the Army, that slows your movement very much. There was also an idea with the military and the economic benefits, it would bind the nation together. I mean, make it smaller in some ways. But that was up against one challenge for Madison and members of his own party, the strict construction of the Constitution. That's where he was walking that fine line. What could Congress do and not do? The bank is not considered by a lot constitutional. The war didn't solve that. Madison is rethinking his constitutional scruples because he's reminding members of his own party, look, strict construction, limited government, I still am a believer in that, but then we got to introduce common sense into the equation. And that's got to be part of the decisions that we actually make. In other words, how do you express the self-confidence of the nation? Well, his answer was building a program that's coherent and will help economic development. One historian said, look, after the War of 1812, we're not looking east anymore. Oh my gosh, across the ocean, Europe, North Africa, what's going to happen with these nations? We're looking to the West. The West, our eyes are turned. I mean, okay, that's an interesting statement to make and one I don't really disagree with. Only bitter Federalists, and there are a few left, they're still around, and members of the old Jeffersonian Republicans, the super strict constructionists, the John Randolphs of Virginia and others, object to any plan that is part of Madison's agenda. Anything new to this group, they don't like. It smacks of corruption, capitalism, and even worse, modernity. All right, it's easy to kind of marginalize them, but they have their scruples. They're worried about an increased role for the government. Now, I don't think they're against any of these ideas, but the question comes down to who should direct things like internal improvements. Should it start at the national level, or should it come from the states? Or should you disperse money from the federal government to the states and let them parse out where that money goes? A question 200 years later we're still dealing with. Madison could rightfully say that his program was very different from what he had opposed, I don't know how, in 1790, but, politicians evolve, flip-flop, whatever term you want to use. And he can say that my big goals for the nation, my big goals for the principles of government have not come undone. We still have to pay down the debt. But the tariff would generate income, he said, and protect American industry. Madison and Jefferson looked to a day when the United States no longer has to bow to the British maritime fleet. We'll become completely independent and not worried about what is happening in Europe if that continent were to go to war again. Responding to Madison's 14th Congress, The 14th Congress, everyone has its name. The first Congress, obviously. The 80th Congress after World War II is pretty significant. The Congress that met in the middle of the Civil War, maybe the most important, started changing the role of government. But Madison's 14th Congress achieved an impressive record. They passed in 1816 a landmark tariff bill. It is protectionist in its implementation and creation. There's no doubt about it. It's often nicknamed a protective tariff. Yes, it was. Here's how it worked. Articles that could not be produced in the United States were placed on the free trade list. We've had this discussion among the historians, and as Dr. Dollar always says, nobody wins a trade war. Usually the losers are especially the people within each of these nations. This was not the intention of the 1816 tariff. So let me repeat that again. Anything that could not be produced in the United States could enter the United States free of the tariff. Why? We didn't make our own version of it. Very simple. So no protection on those items. Items made in the United States to satisfy the domestic market would have a high protective tariff, 20 to 25% of the value of the product. Those items that were produced domestically, meaning we had our own version of it. But the American supply of these items could not catch with the demand, meaning there were more consumers than there were products for certain items. That meant we still had to import equivalent items made overseas. That would have a modest tariff. So 3 levels, if you all understand that. There's absolutely no tariff, the highest tariff on things that were made in the American domestic market, and we made enough of them. And the government had to, augment and change that, huh?
What were the 3 levels?
Sure, the first one was free trade. If we did not have an American-made version of a certain good from Europe, that would enter duty-free, no tariff. Secondly, an item that was made in the U.S. to satisfy the domestic market, meaning we made enough of them, there were, to put it differently, enough consumers with suppliers. There is where you would have the highest tariff, 20 to 25% on the foreign good, because the rationale was we basically have enough in the nation. Why do we need a foreign good? Now, you could still bring it in, it would pay a tariff. The price of the good would be artificially inflated to encourage you, the consumers, to buy the American version of the product. Third, items that were produced domestically, but they could not reach the demand. Let's throw something now. Clocks, watches. We had some manufacturers of these products in the United States, but our producers couldn't keep up with demand. So once we determined that, you could put a modest tax on the foreign good. It allows locally made American products a chance to survive after the war. The alternative is you have complete free trade, which there are a lot of free traders in the United States and in the world, but they're saying the domestic made product, because there's more time experience making that product and they can mass produce them at a lower cost, that would kill the American product. So it gives you a fighting chance. It arrives just in time because the return of peace allows the British to dump cheap goods back on American shores, just like they did after the American Revolution. They even sold these items below cost in a hope to drive American products out of business. That's terrible. Take a loss. But it's not unheard of. Certain companies, Amazon, have done that when they first got started, selling books for really less than what they cost to be produced. That's back in the day when Amazon sold mostly books, and then they sold everything else. And the money that they made built that empire. So yeah, it's not maybe the nicest way to do things. And it wasn't nice for the British to, dump their products back on American shores. But we have now legislation to say, okay, hang on. With any luck, within a 3-year period, it would ensure that less protection would be required and they could lower the rates. That's to help people who had objections to a tariff law passed in the United States. And I want you to understand that there is no geographic objection, north like it, south against it. That happens later. In 1816, Calhoun from South Carolina, and a spokesman for the area, is a strong, ardent nationalist. He supports the tariff. He also understands that we may not recognize this fact either. There are as many textile production mills in the North as the South in 1816. Now, the North accelerated quickly and the South doubled down on their slave plantation cash crop economy. But in that moment, in 1815 and 1816, there was the potential for the country to agree on this as good financial policy. John Randolph of Virginia, there he is, an old Republican Jeffersonian, would argue against the law. He claimed that the tariff fell on the poor and the slave owners of the South, and it's a refrain that's going to be heard many times after 1816, and it's a way to really frustrate the tariff bills as they're reevaluated, basically every 4 years. Just to fast forward a little bit, you know that by 1824 and 1828, the tariff's going to be a huge national issue. It's going to generate, as far as some people like Calhoun eventually said, I mean, you want to talk about a flip-flop, supports it in 1816 and 1828. He says it's unconstitutional. It's generating, some people think, an embarrassing amount of revenue into the United States. Helps the North, hurts the South. Helps the North, hurts the South. That's why Calhoun comes up with his theories about constitutional passage. Okay, so the tariff is put in place. Congress also passed legislation creating the Second National Bank, which started in 1816. It was given a 20-year life, just like the first bank in 1791. That went away in 1811. The year before the war started, we didn't have a national bank. It was hard to run the war. When his Secretary of Treasury tells Madison, what would have been great and helped us get through the war, Madison said, what's that? He's like, a bank! So yeah, and we didn't have a bank. And we had to find other, Gallatin says you got like 3 months in the Treasury to actually fight the war. And then it's down to about a month. And yeah, that would have been nice. The bank was invested with an initial capital of $35 million. That number isn't critical, except for the fact that 7 of it was given by the federal government. So it's a blend of that corporate, private, and public, the United States government, investment and creation. The South and the West, members of Congress, I should say, South and the West, support the bill. Agricultural voters want credit for land notes because not only the Northwest, we dedicate a lot of time and should to the explosion of the population, which moves from the upper South to the lower South, but we should also continue that into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, the Northwest territories. That's why these states are added in pairs, because they're growing at a rapid rate, not just because, we have to have a North and a South. It's necessary because that's where the population is moving in the American West. Few raised eyebrows about the constitutional issues that seemed to be settled, as far as many concerned, by the first Bank of the United States in 1791. No, not everybody. Madison and Jefferson didn't think it was constitutional. One North Carolina quid, Q-U-I-D, is they call themselves the Tertium Quids, which is Latin for a third way. These are folks who are not Jeffersonian Republicans and not Federalists. Yeah.
Can you spell it again?
Sure. Tertium, T-E-R, quids.
Can you spell that again?
Sorry?
Can you spell the quid again?
Yeah, Q-U-I-D-S. They call themselves the Quids. This was a group that thought, our party, the Republican Party, has supported the National Bank. We just can't see where the legal justification for it exists. One of them said, I seem to be the only person who cannot find the authority for the bank in the Constitution of the United States, unquote. He was not alone. but they were in a minority. The president appointed a 5-person committee to be on the bank's board when it was created in 1816. Then Congress got to the important work of infrastructure or internal improvements. Let's go back to the American Communication Network in 1816. They get ready, the national government, to spend real money on transportation needs. They dedicate $100,000, which is real money back then. It's what the government spends on Post-it notes, probably in one department today. Nevertheless, 100 or K-cups for the Pentagon. I have no idea. I'm just throwing out random statistics that are absolutely not true, but whatever. $100,000 to build part of what's called the National Road. It's here on the map. It's sometimes called the Cumberland Road because it begins in Cumberland, Maryland, that thin part of Maryland as it nears West Virginia. So there it is. As you see indicated in the purple, it is called a major road on this map. We had, and you can count them on one hand, right? The major roads in the United States. We had some post roads. We had the coastal road. We had the Natchez Trace and the Federal Road that connected parts of the Deep South. Okay, but here's the National Road. This was going to be a big deal because it was federal dollars dedicated to connect the East to the West. It was going to go through Wheeling, Virginia. It was sometimes, again, called the Cumberland Road at first, sometimes the National Road. So those terms are interchangeable because it's going to go from Cumberland, Maryland, through Wheeling in Virginia, across the Northwest Territories. And you can see it marked right here, National Road, and in parentheses, the Cumberland Road. It's a very ambitious plan. It crossed the Appalachian Mountains, which, yeah, it's not like building a railroad through the West, but hey, it's something. And it was intended to link Baltimore in the Chesapeake, eventually with St. Louis and Missouri on the Mississippi River. So again, a bold, ambitious plan. Nationalists like Henry Clay loved the bill. It would help accommodate Western movement. And settlers were jumping into Indiana, especially after Tecumseh's loss in the Northwest in 1813. It allows Indiana's population to jump very quickly to 63,000 by 1815. What happens then? Statehood. Statehood. But I will tell you, it takes decades to connect the National Road even close to St. Louis. By the time in the 1830s, they moved, with you think federal projects and state projects are slow now. By the time they get the National Road done, they've got this new innovation that's going to move people over land called the rail car. Yeah, the steam locomotive, which will really supplant the building of roads. Yes, please.
Okay, so basically the whole purple, is that the Cumberland Road?
Yes, as it eventually gets connected, I think by the late 1830s to St. Louis.
What about the Chicago and Detroit? It looks like, how would that connect to the rest of it?
Yeah, that was good. That was going to connect basically an alternate route for going across Lake Huron to Lake Michigan. Okay. You're going to have a way to bisect the Michigan territory. I don't know exactly when that was built. I don't believe that was a national project, though it could be wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, but you see what the purpose was here. You then not only connect Lake Erie and Lake Huron to Lake Michigan, but you connect Lake Michigan to the Illinois River, and then again, once again, another gateway into the West. A lot of roads that aren't marked on this are toll roads in New England. New England says, okay, if the national, the question of the national road gets back to things like fairness. If you're not in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and the government says we're building a national road there, and you're like, I don't live there, who cares? The fairness question is there.
Like,
and so
we're a state now and they just leave us out.
What's that? Yeah, yeah. We got rivers. Red River, the Ouachita, the Mississippi, yeah.
Yeah, because at that
Sabine.
point, most of the cities were by the rivers because it was the fastest way for communication in
Yeah.
Louisiana.
Yeah. Plus you get your stuff up the Mississippi and find the Natchez Trace, apparently. Yeah. But that's it. This is, and this is what a lot of people thought was okay. if the national government is going to invest a whopping $100,000 and doesn't build it where you are, you have to take it upon yourself in the state. And there's nothing stopping you. And that's why New England builds these toll roads. The states give the cooperation by which they incorporate they create a corporation and they say, we allow you, the government is involved in this, and you can sell people stock by which they're going to invest in the company. And then when the tolls come in from using the road, that pay back the investors and the state can take some money from it too and all of that. That's what really happens in places like New England. And of course, New York builds, the Erie Canal. They do that on their own over 8 years. So if the nation is going to redefine itself, it's willing to use the term more and more. Democracy, which was a 4-letter word at the time of the revolution, it was a bad word. Suddenly, a word that implied there was too much power. Democracy, hands in the mob and not in the people, is more acceptable after 1815. Anyone who is not a Democrat is an aristocrat or a monocrat. They use that in the political designations. The Northern Republicans, those who were members of Jefferson's party and Madison's party, now take the name Democratic Republicans, and there is no shame in taking that title. You wouldn't have done this in the time of Jefferson's presidency. So they hyphenate the term, and I know it's something somewhat confusing to say, wait a minute, they've just taken our two 2021 modern parties and put them together? Yes. But this is, the key of it is Jefferson's old Republican Party, a Democratic Republican Party, which will eventually splinter in what's called the National Republican Party. So the old coalition of Jefferson and Madison will split after the war. There's no shame, by the way, in celebrating this title. They call themselves the Jeffersonian Republican Party, just the Republicans. They favored a republic. The Federalists were monocrats, and everything that they loved was British. Now in 1815, times have changed dramatically. And I mention that because of what Congress does in 1816 to completely overstep and misjudge the sentiment of the nation. In 1816, many members of Congress discover how powerful people in a democracy can be. In 1816, March specifically, they passed what's called the Compensation Act, one of the most ill-timed and ill-thought-out pieces of legislation in American history. It raises the pay of congressmen to a straight salary. How did congressmen get paid before? $6 per diem, which amounted to about $1,500 per year, which people complained, and they made matters worse, as politicians often did. They said things like, I can't find decent room and boarding, I can't buy decent wine and entertain on this ridiculous $6 per diem. But this is one area where the parties get together, whether they be Jeffersonians, Madisonians, Federalists, tertium quids, the third wave, this idea that the pay was too low. They didn't have a pay raise since 1789, so they thought they were entitled to it. Some complained that the new salary basically doubled their pay, which, yeah, it kind of did. Still, it's less than the compensation, members of Congress, than for 28 different federal civil servants earned in a year. So the congressmen say, why are we getting paid more than the deputy assistant secretary of the Navy or a clerk, 12-month clerk? Now, Congress wasn't in session all the time, probably because there weren't TV cameras. Oops, sorry, let that slip. But anyway, they were in session 1 year, 2 tops. The president called them into session, but this was their complaint. The president, meanwhile, made a lofty salary, $25,000 a year. President Madison's salary. Of that, he had to pay his own expenses. That's changed because I think most of your expenses now are pretty much covered. One historian argues it makes perfect sense in the mood of the nation that if you want to get better talent, and this is one of the historians that's defending the Compensation Act, if you want to get better talent, pay them more, which is not always the case. Paying people more gets them better talent. Look how much we pay the politicians now. Anyway, but I digress, and I am not political in this class. One congressman opines that the Alien and Sedition Act caused less outrage than the debate and passage of the Compensation Act. Why? These people went home after they voted on it, and it went through. Whew. Now the people made their resentment known. Public meetings begin to denounce the unheard of method by which you pay congressmen an actual salary. Toasts made all over the nation about voting out the people who supported the Compensation Act. In Georgia, one congressman was burned in effigy over the issue. Not him actually, but the effigy, the stuffed version of the guy. Critics cite one Maryland legislature. Hi, Mr. Squirrel. There he is again. One Maryland legislature who stated he could not even get a good glass of wine for the per diem salary allotment he was given. It all gets back to the whole out of touch disconnect between congressmen, senators, and the constituents back home. And they pay for this decision. The Congress pays heavily for this decision. The fall elections of 1816, 70% of the 14th Congress does not get sent back. Folks, could you even in your wildest dreams imagine 70% of the United States Congress being turned over 1 year? Wow. Let me give you a modern equivalent. That would be 304 members of the House today gone. That would be 70 senators gone out of 100. What can they pass to make this happen is the next question I ask, of course, but that's just me in favor of a lot of turnover. Even those who opposed now had to make a vow, and they were still in office. The rump 30% who were left, they had to make a vow to get the repeal in place during the 1817 session. So if you survived, or if you campaigned saying, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, well, you still had to stand by the idea that you were going to change that. Congress repealed it, but later put a per diem increase in their salary to $8 a day. It begs the question, is it a career? They were asking these questions. We still ask them today. We don't term limit congressmen or senators. We term limit the president. We talked about term limiting in the 90s, but that didn't go anywhere, and I'm not sure the Supreme Court would stand by Congress allowing that to happen unless you constitutionally amended it. The activist Congress held one more session in 1816, which is known as the lame duck Congress. So the elections had happened, 70% of them were thrown out, and the Congress that meets after that election, called the lame duck Congress. Only 15 of the 81 who voted for the salary bill would be coming back in the next Congress, with 60 of them gone. So in this lame duck session, we know a few things. There's going to be the federal money for the road, the tariff, and the establishment of the second bank. But there was part of the second bank bill that also had to be worked out. Congress had to vote on what was called the 1816 bonus bill. The bank was scheduled to pay the United States $1.5 million as a bonus for the new charter. Once it became established, pay that money back to the United States. Clay and Calhoun, nationalists as they were, proposed that the money be earmarked for roads and a canal project. Seems like a good idea. Calhoun, in surreal words that would defy his actions later, waxed eloquent, stating, quote, "We are under the most imperious obligations to counteract every tendency of disunion. Let us conquer space," unquote. This is why congressmen probably wish there isn't a congressional record. Now we have TV clips to say, well, but you thought this 2 years ago. Well, Calhoun, counteract every tendency to disunion. The man will write in, what, 12 years, a statement saying that nullification is a good idea.
So they wanted the money to be set aside for the roads and the infrastructure.
Sure.
Okay.
The bonus would be paid from the bank to the United States government. Okay, we got $1.5 million. And look, if you've dedicated 100,000 to a road, what can $1.5 million get you? I mean, a vast amount of building plans in other parts of the nation, or dispersing into the states. New England and the South opposed the bill. New England was already building their own roads and really didn't need the money. They have little to gain. Also, here's the other thing, because Calhoun and Clay wanted these to be dedicated to money in the West, which newest part of the country, to win their allegiance, to make sure they are loyal to the old states. Why not dedicate that money? It's a good point. They have little to gain, New England and the South, to gain from development of the West. It'll be a rival to them. It will what? Pull out people who live there and make them settle in the West. The Middle Atlantic states favor it. Of course they do. It's the marketplace of the United States. The Hudson and Delaware was linked with the Ohio and the Great Lakes. It's a great idea. In a way to get more support, Clay and Calhoun are not specific about the dispersal of the money. Maybe that's where they went astray. That brings up the whole congressman being, hopeful for what we would today call pork barrel projects, although not a lot of pork in $1.5 million. It passed narrowly in the House and Senate. Did the bonus bill of 1816. In his last day in office, James Madison vetoes the bonus bill on constitutional grounds. And I put in the notes there, really? How? What was his rationale? He said, I favor a constitutional amendment instead. It's strange since he called for internal improvements in 1816. You can expect that once on his desk, he would sign it. He didn't. And he didn't. He's also wary, as Madison, of a fund created by the Bank of the United States. He thought it would be an invitation to log rolling, political payoffs, corruption, and all that stuff you sometimes get with the bank and the government working together. So he vetoes it, and the Congress doesn't have, again, barely a majority. They don't have the majority to overturn the veto. This is splitting constitutional hairs because he had been okay with a bank, and then he found his scruple. This is what a lot of people thought. I mean, how can you favor the bank, which is on more questionable constitutional grounds than this whole bonus bill, but he's the president and that's his prerogative. In the days before the National Party conventions, we had the process by which both parties chose candidates in 1816. That was the caucus, and the caucus's days might have been numbered, a lot of people are thinking, because it seems a pretty undemocratic way, and you can use democracy now, it's not a four-letter word, where you have a group of people in one party, House and Senate, gather, and they just say, it's going to be you or you, and everyone else is like, what about me? So it's a bygone practice where you connect, I think, the revolution and your bona fides in the revolution to national ability to win office as the president. In March of 1816, the Republicans members choose James Monroe, to really no one's surprise, and Daniel Tompkins as the Republican Party nominees for that year. It's a close vote because Monroe was something of a controversial cabinet member. He had served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of War. A lot of people couldn't forgive him that, but it was during the war, and Madison needed him. These two rivals became close associates. The other issue at stake, raised by some people, was that the third Virginia president, really, it bothered the Federalists at the Hartford Convention in 1814. That's why we have the term the Virginia dynasty to this day. But for the most part, a dull presidential campaign followed. It's almost a foregone conclusion at the end of the war that James Monroe was going to win. It's just, would the Federalists nominate anybody, and who would it be? Well, it's our old friend Rufus King, mentioned in, of course, Freeman's book. They thought they had something of a resurgence to the Federalists in 1808, which they did. That resurgence did not continue in 1816. This would be the last year, the last presidential contest where the Federalists actually ran a candidate. The Federalists had not even bothered to nominate a vice president. So they don't have what we call a modern ticket. They just are scattered among several men who would just come in and be vice president, win the second number of electoral votes. Monroe's easy victory reflected the spirit of national self-satisfaction and congratulations, the nation patting itself on the back. The Republican Party, this is an endorsement of them. I mean, they had the first election after the war. During the war, they barely won. After the war, they won handily. They had survived the divides over the conduct of the war. It was a success. Madison had at first looked incompetent. He came out pretty good at the end of this contest. No one, and this is what he wanted, would accuse him of authoritarianism, of becoming some kind of militarism, taking advantage of the war just to increase the powers of the president. He didn't do that. He didn't want to do that. And that was more a legacy shown in the election, that they endorsed what he supported as his candidate. I mean, Madison supported James Monroe, no doubt. The Republican way of war was on a shoestring, and the nation appreciated that. You borrowed money, you didn't have high taxes, the taxes were temporary, you didn't have repressive laws. The Federalists can never get over being branded as unpatriotic and disloyal with the Hartford Convention in 1814. News of the Hartford Convention, along with the Treaty of Ghent and the Battle of New Orleans, that was it. It's the end of the Federalist Party. Many thought their actions were treasonable, calling for constitutional, which they weren't, but it looked that way, calling for constitutional amendments to change the vote for war, to limit the place where a president could be from, not having two successive presidents from the same state, things like that. So in our moment of triumph, the Federalists were going to alter the Constitution and change the powers of the president. That didn't look very good, because from most people's perspective in the country, even reluctant Federalists, I read you the quote from John Adams, said, John Adams said, my gosh, Madison is going to get more laurels than any of his predecessors combined. I think he was accurate with that statement.